Hello everyone! In this video, we are going to review how you use in-text citations in your writing and what they are supposed to look like. So, what exactly is an in-text citation? You use in-text citations when you are citing your sources in your physical writing. It puts the important information about that source in parentheses after your quotes, and we use them to give credit to the source that you are quoting. You will mostly use in-text citations in your formal writing, things like TDAs and research papers and literary analysis essays. However, we can use in-text citations when we're doing things like journal writing that is a little bit more informal. If we're doing an independent reading journal, you might want to pull a direct quote from your book, and that's going to require a citation. So, what exactly does an in-text citation look like? What I have here is a sample citation as well as quote that you might use within your writing. So I'm going to go over all of the different parts and what you should use when you are creating an in-text citation. Our sentence reads, Scrooge sneered, "It is enough for a man to understand his own business and not to interfere with other people's." Dickens 10. This quote comes from A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. The main character's name is Scrooge, so I would use this particular quote when talking about maybe Scrooge's character. Now let's talk about all of the different parts. Our first part is the quote introduction, aka the dialogue tag. We use quote introductions in order to lead our reader into the quote. If we don't, then we're just dropping the quote in the middle with no context, and that's called, I call it quote bombing. So we introduce the quote so that our readers know that a quote is coming up. They're not startled with just a random quote in the middle of the writing. This is also the I that we have in taste. The next part is actually our citation. So within the in-text citation, the very first thing you should use is the author's last name. In this case, A Christmas Carol is by Charles Dickens, so I have the last name Dickens first. Then it's your page number. Okay, it is important for us to know what page number this is found on so that somebody could go back into a copy of A Christmas Carol, probably specifically the copy that you have, and check to see, oh, yes, this is actually a direct quote that is found on page 10 of this copy of A Christmas Carol. I say this copy because when we get into things like books, you get multiple different versions, which is also why it is so important when we do research papers or literary analysis that you cite the actual book that you are reading, even though everybody in the class might be reading the same book. I also want to point out in this in-text citation, you do not need a comma in between the author's last name and the page number. That is something that has recently changed within MLA format, so you don't have to worry about that. In fact, there should not be a comma in between the author's last name and the page number. And then the last thing I want to point your attention to is the fact that there is no period at the end of the quote. The period comes after the in-text citation. This is because even though theoretically the quote ends with the end quotes, we still have to include Dickens 10 within the sentence. It's still a part of the sentence. If you don't include it in the sentence and you put a period right where that little arrow is, then you have a random phrase that's an incomplete sentence, it's an incomplete thought, and you would get docked points for conventions. So, when you are writing any type of quote within any of the writing that you do, it should look something like this. Now, there are different types of in-text citations, and these are only a few that we would use throughout the course of the year. So a print source with an author is normally a traditional book. It might be a newspaper if you physically have the newspaper in your hands, and that is going to be the author's last name and page number. Now let's say you have a print source, or in this case, an internet source without a page number. An example of a print source without a page number might be the PSSA. You will not have a page number within the PSSA because everybody's page numbers are going to be different. So for a print source, you would just put the author's last name and paragraph number. The same goes with if you are, for example, using Lancaster Online as your newspaper source and there is not a page number there, but they have authors, so you would do the author's last name and the paragraph number there. And then lastly, most of the time for poems, we're only studying one specific poem. We're not studying an anthology. So for a poem without a page number, it is the author's last name and stanza number. Remember, a stanza is similar to a paragraph within the context of a poem. So, one of the major things that I will always say is if you are not sure if you should in-text cite your quote, you should cite it. When in doubt, cite your quote. This is because you could get called on the carpet for plagiarism if you don't. I would rather tell you, hey, you might not necessarily need to cite the quote there. That's not really a quote. It's not really a paraphrase, something like that, then have to have the awkward conversation with you of, hey, because you didn't cite your quotes within your final essay, that technically counts as plagiarism. Nobody wants to do that, so we all want to be on the same page. When in doubt, cite your quotes, especially if you are pulling it from any sort of source. Lastly, if you need a refresher on either in-text citations or MLA format, or if you are writing a paper and you need APA format, which I know is used in science class, you should use a website called the Purdue Owl. Okay, I use the Purdue Owl all the time, even when I'm writing papers for school. So that website is owl.purdue.edu. This is the end-all be-all website of all of the different types of citation formats. So all of your questions could also be answered there.